Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We are here today to talk to you about recent FDA regulatory changes that impact tests that are run at clinical laboratories as laboratory-developed tests, otherwise known as LDTs. These regulatory changes are commonly referred to as the LDT rule. Next slide, please. A quick introduction in case you're not familiar with MCRA. We are a global CRO and integrated regulatory advisory firm. We have a deep medical device therapy specialization for the US and international markets, providing companies with the intelligence that they need for success throughout the commercialization process. To provide that intelligence, our teams are often led by expert former regulatory authority officials like myself. Next slide, please. So at MCRA, we offer many services in addition to regulatory and CRO services. Those include reimbursement, health, economics, and market access, quality assurance and staffing, healthcare compliance and GDPR, cybersecurity, due diligence, and our new AI and imaging center. These services, when combined, effectively support medical device firms from beginning to end when introducing their devices to US and global markets. Next slide, please. So regarding the logistics for today's webinar, if you have any questions, you can submit those questions via the Q&A function that's located at the bar at the top of the webinar screen. You may also put questions into the chat. So all registered participants will receive a recording of the webinar after the event. And your continued participation in this webinar, since it's being recorded, is a consent to that recording. A PDF of the slides will also be emailed to registered participants. And if you'd like to contact us, contact information for each presenter will be included in the post-webinar email. And you may also email us at info@micra.com to connect with any of the presenters today. Next slide, please. So joining myself on today's webinar will be Dan Goldstein, who is the Senior Director of Quality Assurance, and Julie Martel, the Vice President of IVD Clinical Affairs. And I am James Mullally, the Vice President of IVD Regulatory Affairs at MCRA. Next slide, please. As an agenda for today's webinar, we will be discussing how the new LDT rule impacts regulation of laboratory-developed tests, from potential regulatory submission requirements to quality system requirements, and the potential need to develop analytical and clinical data. Next slide, please. We'll begin by discussing the overall regulatory implications due to the new rule. Next slide, please. But before we get into the details about the LDT rule specifics, it's important to consider the historical context of the regulation of IVDs. So the Medical Devices Amendments of 1976 were a significant turning point for the regulation of medical devices in the United States. Before this time, medical devices were not subject to comprehensive regulatory oversight by the federal government. But these amendments established a framework that classified devices into three categories based on their risk to patients. Class 1 devices for low risk, Class 2 for moderate risk devices, and Class 3 for high risk devices. The amendments also put into place a regulation structure that is proportionate to those risks in terms of the pre-market and post-market requirements, which I'll discuss later. Now, by FDA's own definition, LDTs are tests that are designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. Historically, FDA has exercised enforcement discretion over these tests. This enforcement discretion allowed hospital clinical laboratories to develop diagnostic tests that were essential for clinical management of their patient populations that would otherwise not be available. Recognizing the benefit of continued access to these niche tests, FDA chose not to enforce applicable laws and regulations in 1976. But as FDA notes in their new rule, they believe that the nature and type of LDTs has changed significantly since 1976. Thus, the new rule helps establish guardrails for tests that they believe do not fit within their original concept for LDT enforcement discretion. Next slide, please. So what did FDA change in order to communicate their new approach to regulation of LDTs? Well, they issued a new rule via the Federal Register, and that included a comment period. At the end of that comment period, FDA considered all of the submitted comments and then issued their final rule on May 6th, 2024. The new rule amends FDA's regulations to make it explicit that IVDs are devices under the Act, including when the manufacturer of the IVD is a laboratory. So here I have copied the regulation that was amended, and as you can see in the bold lettering, the new wording that was added to that regulation. I won't read the whole thing, but in essence it says, in vitro diagnostic products are those reagents, instruments, and systems intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, including when the manufacturer of these products is a laboratory. Next slide, please. So let's quickly review FDA's phased compliance approach for laboratory developed tests as implemented by the new rule, and then we can talk about what tests these phases apply to. So this phased approach is intended so that laboratories have adequate time to comply with these new regulatory requirements. So beginning at stage 1, which is May 6th, 2025, 1 year after the final rule was published, laboratories must comply with medical device reporting requirements, corrections and removals reporting, and quality system requirements pertaining to complaint files. By stage 2, which is May 6th, 2026, labs must additionally meet requirements not covered in other stages. These include registration and listing, labeling requirements, and investigational use requirements. In stage 3, May 6, 2027, compliance with all other quality system requirements under 21 CFR Part 820 is required, beyond those that are covered already in stage 1. In stage 4, beginning November 6, 2027, pre-market review requirements for high-risk LDTs, which are generally those considered as Class 3 devices, come into effect. If a pre-market submission is made by this date, FDA will exercise enforcement discretion for continued marketing during this period. And finally, in stage 5, which is May 6, 2028, pre-market review requirements extend to moderate and low-risk LDTs. These are generally considered Class 2 and Class 1 devices. Again, with enforcement discretion if those submissions are received by this date. Next slide, please. So like in 1976, FDA appears through their rule to have recognized the benefit of availability of certain types of LDTs, and thus they have implemented multiple levels of enforcement discretion. So first we'll discuss IVDs that remain under total enforcement discretion. In other words, these tests do not need to comply with any FDA laws and regulations. The first type are those dubbed 1976 type LDTs. These include tests that employ manual techniques without automation, performed by specialized lab personnel. They use components that are legally marketed for clinical use, and they are designed, manufactured, and used within a single CLIA-certified laboratory for high-complexity testing. Then there are certain HLA tests that are used for transplantation, and these FDA explicitly excluded HLA tests from this category when they're used for blood transfusion. Then there are forensic use tests, which are tests intended solely for law enforcement purposes. And finally, there are tests that are manufactured and performed within the Veterans Health Administration or Department of Defense, when those are used exclusively for patients that are tested and treated within those systems. The next level of enforcement discretion is for IVDs that have enforcement discretion for pre-market review and some quality systems. explicitly subpart M, which is for records. Those include laboratory-developed tests that are for unmet needs. And these are developed by laboratories integrated within a healthcare system to address unmet needs to patients within that system. And then there are currently marketed IVDs offered as LDTs, provided that those tests are marketed before May 6th, 2024. And finally, in this category are non-molecular anti-sera LDTs for rare red blood cell antigens. And these tests are marketed and performed by blood establishments where no alternative IVDs are available. And finally, the next level is enforcement discretion for pre-market review only. So all other requirements apply. In this case, these tests, this level of enforcement discretion applies to laboratory-developed tests that have been approved by the New York State Clinical Laboratory Evaluation Program, or they also apply to certain modified versions of 510(k) cleared or de novo authorized tests. So those are the three levels of enforcement discretion that are provided in the rule. And any other test that does not meet any of these definitions for enforcement discretion is likely to be subject to the full regulatory requirements for all enforcement phases. So next slide, please. So do these enforcement discretion policies mean that the tests will be under enforcement discretion for all time? Well, that depends. So the rule also accounts for the potential for modifications to a device. So when that device would otherwise be under some type of enforcement discretion, we have to consider modifications. This consideration, therefore, primarily applies to devices that are under conditional enforcement discretion, i.e. those that are under enforcement discretion because they were either laboratory-developed tests marketed before May 6th, 2024, laboratory-developed tests that were approved by the New York State Department of Health, or laboratory-developed tests that are a modification of an FDA-cleared or granted test. So what types of modifications might trigger the need for a 510(k) or other type of regulatory submission? In FDA's recent guidance for laboratories, FDA refers to their longstanding guidance document, deciding when to submit a 510(k) for a change to an existing device. So this guidance outlines considerations for changes to devices, including devices like IVDs, that would trigger the need for a pre-market submission. And within this guidance is a very helpful flowchart for manufacturers to follow when deciding whether or not a pre-market submission is needed. In addition to reference to this guidance, which is applicable to Class 2 devices and Class 1 devices that need 510(k)s, FDA also mentions in their new rule reference to regulations that pertain to PMA devices. So it looks like FDA's consideration of the types of changes that require new submissions are very similar to those existing for the current regulatory paradigm for FDA-regulated products. Next slide, please. So whether or not you are offering a laboratory-developed test that's new to the market, or if you've made changes to an existing LDT that are significant enough, you may need a submission to FDA. And there are many different types of submissions that go to FDA, but regarding submissions that allow for marketing of a device in the US for the first time, we're specifically talking about 510(k)s, de novos, and pre-market approvals. So as you will notice from the FDA review times listed on this slide, these review times are different for each of these three submission types. And the reason for that is that they correspond to the complexity of the review. Generally, low and moderate risk devices are appropriate for a 510(k) submission or a de novo, and these submissions take less time for FDA to review than do higher risk devices that are likely to be submitted as a PMA. And not surprisingly, these review times also correspond to higher administrative fees. So a 510(k) and de novos tend to have lower fees, or do have lower administrative fees than do PMA devices, which have the highest administrative fee. And in addition to these fees, one has to consider the other regulatory burdens associated with a submission, and that's generating data. So for a successful FDA submission, you'll also need to provide FDA with protocols and data from analytical and clinical validation studies. And my colleague, Julie Martel, will discuss this with you in more detail. Finally, to maintain your device on the market, there's some additional regulatory burden in terms of post-market activities, with PMA devices having the heaviest regulatory burden. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have at the end of this webinar, but with this, I will pass it over to my colleague, Dan Goldstein, who will discuss quality management with you. Dan?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jim. I'm happy to follow Jim here. It's not coincidental. We'll be talking a lot about how regulatory decisions and regulatory submissions will affect what you need to do in terms of quality management. I'm Dan Goldstein. I'm Senior Director for Quality Assurance here at MCRA. Next slide, please. So briefly, we're going to be discussing who needs a quality management system. And just as a side note, FDA until now has called them quality systems. Everybody else in the world calls them quality management systems. There is no difference between a QS and a QMS. We do it interchangeably. We'll talk about who needs one. What does the QMS actually need to have in it? When will it need? When will the QMS need those different elements specifically in the context of this final rule, which differs from regular FDA regulations? Who's going to put the QMS together? Once it exists, who's going to run it? And finally, how is FDA going to inspect the facility? And to a lot of you, I'll have to say, will FDA inspect your facility? And we'll discuss that briefly as well. Next slide, please. So first of all, Jim has already given us some examples of different kinds of exemptions. And just as a reminder, as Jim said at the very beginning, the entire world of LDTs has up until now been under what FDA calls an enforcement discretion. That doesn't mean that they weren't medical devices. A lot of people would have said they were always medical devices, but the regulations were not being applied to them. And now the regulations are being generally applied to LDTs, slowly within stages, and exempting certain tests and certain facilities from certain requirements. Some from submission requirements, regulatory submissions, which as you saw were mostly in stages 4 and 5, and some exemptions for certain tests and certain facilities within stages 1, 2, and 3 for the quality systems. The thing to keep in mind is that a quality system, a quality management system, is specific to a place. It's a location, it's a facility. FDA inspects a building, a campus, and it looks at the quality management system for that location. So if a location has a single test that now will qualify as an IVD device, that location needs to have a quality management system for medical devices. This is true, by the way, also of non-IVD devices and products. If a company makes medical devices and other things that are not medical devices, which is plausible, the company is required by regulations to have a quality management system to run the facility. And some of its products won't have to be managed under the procedures within that quality management system, but the system applies to the building and to all the activities within the building that are relevant to medical devices. So there will be a fair number of LDT owners, laboratories, who will have a quality management system that might not apply to all of the products within their facility. So the first thing that Jim has sort of discussed briefly is determining whether the company is exempt, whether the company's tests are exempt from any of the stages in the final rule. And by the way, I'm throwing in the word establish here because that's an FDA word straight from the regulation. To establish it means you have to define it, you have to document it, and you have to implement it. Because when FDA comes to inspect, they will want to see how the facility determined which of its tests were not subject to which parts of the regulation. And as Jim indicated, it's going to get a little complicated. Different companies and different tests will be subject to different parts of the quality regulations. Again, there's going to be a regulatory determination as to where things apply, and regulatory drives quality, always. The quality system follows what regulatory is determined is the scope. So for the rest of my portion, I'm going to be discussing what applies to companies and to tests that are not completely exempt from those first 3 stages of the 5-stage path of the final rule. Next slide, please. So first question, what does the QMS need? When does it need it? Stage 1, May 6th. This coming May 6th. FDA calls out more or less 4 regulations here. First of all, there's one piece of the quality system regulation, the QSR Part 820. The only piece is complaint files, complaint handling, medical device reporting for adverse events. And FDA talks a lot about Part 806 and a little about Part 7. I won't get into the weeds here, but there's a separate regulation for correcting a device out in the field, removing a device from the field, and then when that's considered to be a recall. There's a lot of overlap there, but the requirements are not identical. One of the interesting things about the new final rule is you could be a laboratory. There could be a laboratory whose LDT is now going to be considered to be an IVD device, but the laboratory intends to only make it for themselves, use it themselves within the facility, never sell it to anybody else. Corrections, removals, recalls, all of that applies only to things that have left your control. So for a company that maintains all of its tests, all of its products within its facility, including the software, nothing has been distributed outside of the manufacturer's control. So corrections, removals, and recalls won't apply, no matter what kinds of fixes have to be done to the product. Those are all considered stock recoveries, in FDA's nomenclature. Bottom line is complaint files, complaint handling is going to apply to most of the manufacturers, a lot. Stage 1 will apply to a lot of companies. And medical device reporting, which is for adverse events. Now, again, here the interesting thing is a lot of IVD device manufacturers never have an adverse event. It's plausible. It depends on the type of device. I can tell you that FDA told all of the COVID test manufacturers who received emergency use authorization for their products, here's your EUA letter, you've got emergency use authorization. For now, because of the public health emergency, you don't have to treat your device as a device with all of FDA's requirements. Well, you do have to do complaint handling. Oh, also you have to do adverse event reporting under the MDR regulation, Part 803. Oh, and by the way, we at FDA consider false negative, or false positive results to be adverse events. So those manufacturers had to have procedures for handling complaints, procedures for reporting, MDRs, adverse events to FDA. Essentially, by May 6, 2025, everyone who is subject to stage 1 ought to have procedures for controlling these activities, including the activities that probably they're not going to have to perform. Maybe recalls, corrections, and removals, you can skip that one if nothing is ever distributed. And if your quality system says from day 1, we never distribute any tests, including software, you can't have software out on the web where somebody can download it, that's been distributed. But certainly medical device reporting, even if you think you'll never report an adverse event, you have to have a procedure for it. Complaint handling, everyone has to have a procedure for it. And by the way, FDA says that anytime somebody alleges that there's something wrong with the product, even though the allegation is patently wrong and mistaken when it's received, that's still a complaint. It's still handled as a complaint. It's still a complaint report is open for it, and a decision is made as to how much investigation is required. So the procedures will be in place. There'll be forms in place. Here's our complaint form. Here's the information we put into a PDF or onto a screen in our software whenever somebody alleges a deficiency in our product. So you have the procedures in place by May 6th, and by that day, you start using those procedures. From that point on, anyone who alleges a deficiency in the device, we're creating a record for it, a quality record. From that point on, any complaint that turns out to actually have been an adverse event where someone was injured, someone could have been injured, some harm could have come to them through a malfunction of the test, the device, you're creating a record for that also. So by that date in 2025, the procedures are in place, the records are starting to be created. The final rule really doesn't talk about Part 7 in terms of actually enforcement. It uses it as an example to say, here's what a recall is, but Part 806 leads right into recalls. So a company is going to have in place procedures for handling these activities by this coming May 6th. Next slide, please. May 2026, Not a big addition, actually. You've got the three on the left that we talked about before, those four regulations. What's new on the right, first of all, parts 801 and 809 are called out by the final rule specifically. That is labeling requirements. And to be honest, some of FDA's requirements for labeling would apply to a normal consumer product, even if it weren't a medical device. Things like, who made it, when it was made, when it expires. Some of this stuff is obvious. There are details in Part 801 or Part 809, which is specific for IVD devices, that need to be followed and that FDA will check for. And because Part 801 calls out Part 830, which is for unique device identification, those barcodes or QR codes that you now have on every medical device, that's going to have to be followed as well. And again, the manufacturer will have to have procedures that say, here's how we do labeling, including, if necessary, here's how we create UDI codes. So that's all going to be in place as well. Now, the final rule also calls out Part 812, which is the regulation for clinical trials, investigational use requirements, which Julie will be able to speak about, and a separate regulation, Part 807, for registration and listing. Those regulations will apply to companies that are working with a product that FDA considers to be an IVD device, but you don't actually have to have any procedures within the quality management system. Now, Part 812, it's a bear. There's a lot of work involved in Part 812, but the quality management system doesn't address it because those are products that are not yet commercially distributed medical devices. So something that has a investigational device exemption under Part 812, those devices have their own quality procedures, which the quality system that the manufacturer runs on a day-to-day basis don't touch. Part 807, frankly, it's very easy. Registration listing, honestly, anybody can do it. People do ask us to help them with that, and that's fine, but these are low-level activities. Once you're required to register your facility, the physical location, and to list the devices that you make, once that's required of you, you'll pay a fee somewhere under $10,000. And again, any questions you have, we can answer, FDA can answer. Part 807 is not a serious burden. Parts 801 and 809 aren't very time consuming, but you will have to have procedures within your growing quality management system to address them. So we're about to talk about May 2027, and the next slide is going to be somewhat busier. So next slide, please. So that's everything. Not all of these apply to all medical devices, but most of these apply to most medical devices. You'll notice that most of the items here, these are all separate parts of that FDA Part 820, the regulation for quality systems. You'll see that these are separate sections of that regulation. Most device manufacturers will have more or less a separate SOP for each of these. Not exactly. People often combine sections 120 and 130 for labeling and packaging, or handling, storage, and distribution. That's very common. Sometimes Part 820.80 for which is about receiving your raw materials, your components that you use, inspecting them first when you receive them, and then as you're putting things together, your in-process inspections, and inspecting the final device once it's fully manufactured to make sure it's all good. A lot of companies will break that up into separate procedures. That's fine. By the way, FDA doesn't care. If FDA says, if you want to create one very, very long document without any parts, without any separate SOPs that covers your entire quality system, that's acceptable. It's extremely difficult. Everybody recommends against it, but you can. Typical medical device manufacturers have somewhere in the ballpark of 25, 30, maybe 35 separate procedures, along with various work instructions, forms that gets filled out. But this is the framework that you're building on, more or less. You can see in the lower left there, traceability. That's only required for life-preserving devices, certain implants. Not a lot of IVD device manufacturers are going to fall into that one. You can see complaint files up on the upper right. Well, we had that from the beginning. You can see medical device reporting, and note that's a separate regulation, Part 803, not Part 820. Some of these things are familiar. You're getting down to the lower right. What's risk management? ISO 14971. That is an international standard for risk management for medical devices. It's used by companies the world over, and it's there because FDA's regulation basically forgot about risk management. Part 820.30 in design controls says, oh, by the way, if you're designing a medical device, you need to cover software development, validation, and risk management for the device. But all of that is external to the actual Part 820 regulation. So we use this ISO standard, which is fairly long and somewhat burdensome. You create certain documents to describe how you handle the hazards that could be inherent in the use of the device. If there's any electrical, innards to the device at all, and instrumentation of your own, IEC, an international standard for medical equipment, medical electrical equipment safety, that will apply to you. 60601 has various subparts for if it's a device intended for home use, which applies to a lot of IVD devices. And then those two FDA guidances at the end. So first of all, any software at all in instrumentation that belongs to you, that you build or that you have built for you, the simplest firmware, that's software. And FDA has had guidance documents over the years. The newest one only came out last summer, and that describes the documentation you create specifically for software. And then that last one, cybersecurity, if you have any software in the device, pretty much, you're going to have to think about cybersecurity, and there's a separate guidance document for this. So this is a lot. Not all of stage 3 is going to apply to all of the LDTs that are coming in under the final rule. And Jim did mention that there are going to be some exemptions. Some devices are only going to fall under the general records requirement down there near the bottom there, 820.180, which is really not very burdensome. Basically, how you maintain your records in printed form, in electronic form, it's not a big burden. As you sort of expand on this, you'll see more and more requirements coming in. Can we see the next slide, please? I just want to point out a few of these. So first of all, the quality manual, you really ought to have one of these. It's basically just an index. It says, here's how our quality manual is built. Here's our organizational structure. Here's who's in charge of things. Here's how the different SOPs call each other out. So for example, you've got a complaint handling procedure. Your complaint handling procedure is going to say, hey, you know something, if we get multiple complaints about the same product, do we have non-conforming product that we haven't detected? That's 820.90. For example, or do we have to open a CAPA? Do we have to open a corrective action under 820.100? So the quality manual not only says, here's all our procedures and what they do, but here's how they work with each other. It's a good index to have. Those next two, management reviews and quality audits, if you have a medical device, and if you're subject to the full Part 820 more or less, then you're going to be holding management reviews. These are formal meetings, more or less once a year, some companies more often. Very specific people are there, reviewing very specific information and making decisions. You're also going to have audits of yourselves. You're going to conduct your own internal audit. And by the way, again, these are activities that take place outside of medical devices, but now they're going to be taking place according to the exact requirements of Part 820. And these activities aren't specific to the device itself. You have a management review whether or not you've got one device or 100 devices. The same thing with the audits. And the structure of an internal audit doesn't change much depending on the kind of device it is. I mean, honestly, if you look at the agenda for an audit for somebody who makes an MRI machine and somebody who makes, Band-Aids, they still require, somebody who's independently auditing the company, and somebody who's looking at the complaint files, and somebody's reporting to top management what they found. These are general procedures under a quality system that are not specific to the device. I pointed out design controls and purchasing controls only because there's some exemptions that are going to apply only certain parts of the quality system requirement, the QSR Part 820, to only certain requirements, not the whole thing. But you should pay attention to those certain things. They may seem small, but they can be big. So we'll be talking about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So some of the things about this partial application of stage 3. So for example, we mentioned there, according to the final rule, there's some devices that only have to apply design controls, purchasing controls, acceptance activities, CAPAs, and quality records. And remember, there's some that only have to apply quality records controls. That's not a lot. But when you see this list of 4 or 5 items, again, quality records, that's not very burdensome. You'll have to trust me on this. Purchasing controls, that can be burdensome for the company not from a medical device perspective. I mean, think about your inventory controls and your accounting systems. But from a medical device perspective, purchasing controls are not that hard. Design controls, honestly, are a bear. FDA has a fairly strict and clear, but not short procedure that you go through in creating a new design for a medical device or for changing the design of a device you already have. And remember, Jim mentioned that you may need to make a submission for a change to a device. Once it's a medical device, even if you don't have to submit the change to FDA, you still go through the process of design changes under design controls. And design controls include software validation, so that FDA guidance that I mentioned for software development, and the one for cybersecurity. And design controls under the FDA quality system regulation includes risk management. So again, that international standard, that 14971, that'll apply as well. So just having a short list doesn't mean that it's a small burden. Now, again, if it's only compliance with quality records, we can assist as needed, but it's really going to not be a lot to do. Next slide, please. So you have to have a quality management system. Who's going to build it? FDA doesn't care. You can write your own quality management system. FDA is completely supportive of that. You can find lots of information online, honestly. If you've never done it before, it's not easy to do it right. And again, when FDA inspects, they do check to make sure that the quality management system is compliant with the regulations. Not a lot of companies that are new startups write their own quality management system. When you form a company with 14 people who just came out of other medical device companies with experience in quality and regulatory work, yeah, a lot of times they will write their own. Somebody can write it for you. We write a lot of quality management systems for our clients. Other people write them as well. It's not an unusual activity. There's software systems called electronic QMS and eQMS, which is generally a subscription service where most of the quality system, really never all of it, but a lot of it is simply in screens. You simply put in information according to screen prompts and it guides you to the next step. And then it creates records for you. There's about 30 of these or so on the market right now, more or less, that claim compliance to the regulations. And you can subscribe to one of them if you want. But that's just putting it together. And as much as it sounded like a lot of work that I was describing to create this quality system, once you have it, you have to run it. Personnel have to be there. Now, I realize that as a laboratory, you already have quality personnel there. Your quality assurance team is going to be running now this quality management system for medical devices. And what's really interesting is FDA doesn't have a lot of requirements in terms of their expertise. The FDA investigator is not going to come in and grill the company about, well, does your quality manager have 10 years experience with devices? And, can you show me their diploma? They'll see that they were hired appropriately. They'll see that they were trained appropriately. But what FDA really wants to know is, does top management support the quality team? Because the worst thing that can happen is you have quality personnel in place. You've got a quality management system that they're running, but they're not receiving what they need in order to run it. So, and this again from the regulation, if you're managing or performing or assessing work affecting quality, do you have responsibility for it? Do you have the authority? Can you make decisions even if top management doesn't like them? And that's the independence also. Can the quality team say, there is a problem here that has to be addressed, and not have the CEO say, oh, don't worry about that? That's what FDA is coming to ask. And FDA will ask the CEO of a company often, what kind of authority have you given your quality team? Can you give me an example of where they made a decision and you let them make that decision even though it wasn't easy for the company? So that's really FDA's requirement. Have a quality team, has to have the resources it needs, has to have enough people in it, and you have to give them all the resources they need to work effectively. Next slide, please. FDA inspection. So FDA is a very, very old system that they've been using since the late 90s called the Quality System Inspection Technique. They have various quality program, compliance program guidance manuals. They have a whole system that they use. We do mock FDA inspections for companies, and we use basically their manuals also. In a future slide, you'll see how that's actually going to be changing to some extent. But the point is FDA has a system for inspecting. And it's not going to be any different for the laboratories that become medical device manufacturers that get inspected. You generally don't get inspected by FDA until registration, listing are performed. So FDA sees that you've got a registered company with listed devices. It may take years after that because FDA knows that these systems are being ramped up. When FDA comes to inspect in 2027 or 2032 or whatever, they always review the quality system. Always. They always review the records that are created with that quality system. So, oh, here's your show me your SOP for inspecting received goods. Okay, now show me your received goods inspection records from last week, from last month, from last year. This always happens. FDA makes sure that you have SOPs in place that follow the regulations. FDA makes sure that you use your SOPs to create the proper records. That's what they're looking for. And they can go back in time if they want, right? Because their concern is, well, we haven't been here in 3 years or 5 years or ever. how do we FDA know that things were being performed well up until now? Because the theory is if FDA comes to inspect and they see that basically the quality system is compliant and basically the company is following the quality system, now FDA has confidence that in the future, it's going to work that way too. FDA can leave, say goodbye to everybody, and the following week and the following month and the following year, the company will continue to manufacture consistently and reliably a safe and effective device. That's what the QMS is for. So FDA might not show up until 2030. And when they walk in 2030, they'll knock on the door, they'll give you 5 days notice if within the US, and they'll say, hi, can we see your complaint records? Can we see your adverse event records, your medical device report records? And by the way, can we see them going back to 2025? Because that's when your complaint handling procedure was created. That's a plausible scenario. That's why you need to start creating the proper records. If it applies to you, if you fall under stage 1, already in the late spring of 2025, you're going to be creating those complaint records, and you'll use your records handling procedure to maintain those records in good form and safe and somewhere that you can know they're secure, because you don't know when FDA is going to want to see them. The next slide, please. So the QMSR, the Quality Management System Regulation. So I was mentioning the Quality System Regulation, pretty much the same since 1997. They tweak it occasionally. I mentioned, UDIs, unique device identification, those VAR codes and QR codes. They occasionally add little bits and pieces like that to Part 820, the Quality System Regulation. Basically, it's more or less the same structure and contents as since 1997. But there's this international standard called ISO 1345, which is what every country pretty much outside the United States uses to manage their quality systems for medical devices. And ISO 1345 has evolved over the years much more than the QSR has. And ISO 1345 and the Quality System Regulation are what they call harmonized. They don't contradict each other. They're more or less aligned. Now FDA is taking the final steps. They're going to replace most of the FDA regulation with pieces of that international standard ISO 1345. The final rule was released recently. It's going to come into place only in February 2026. They changed the name from Quality System Regulation to Quality Management System Regulation. The name change makes no difference. This change is really administrative to a large extent. There are going to be some new requirements, but not a lot. Adding maybe between 5, 10, maybe 15% more requirements to a quality system that's in place. All right. But the point is the structure changes, some of the nomenclature changes. It's just easier if you're writing new SOPs now to say, okay, February 2026, this is already going to apply. Write the new procedures according to the structure and the nomenclature of the QMSR. So yes, complaint handling will be according to FDA's regulation, but you'll be putting it into a structure that follows the order of activities of ISO 1345, just because it's all coming online during the same time period. And I believe that's my last slide. Next slide, please. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. So if you are like me, it is a little bit overwhelming. There is a lot of things to consider. Hi, my name is Julia Martel. I'm the VP of Clinical Affairs here for IVD. And as you heard from my colleague, there's a lot of consideration that are to be addressed for your product, that it is from a regulatory perspective, but also from a QMS perspective. By assessing your gap, and we can go to the other slide, please, you may notice that you are deficient in some of the data requirement for your submission, if applicable. We recommend that you identify those data gaps sooner than later, because it will take you some time to gain some of that data, because clinical study and analytical studies do take time. So as represented here, you're going to embrace the final rule, understand where your gaps are. And if as part of those gaps, you realize that there's some analytical studies that are missing that needs to be completed, there might be also some validation clinical studies that needs to be either repeated, extended. And there is no one form fits all, because depending your intended use, depending your technology, if it's going to be a PMA, potentially a 510K, the magnitude of the work that needs to be done, especially from a clinical study, will be very dependent. But please know that here at MCRA, we have a lot of experience helping clients support their analytical studies as well as their clinical studies. And you can reach out to us and we can help you identify those gaps, but also get you the sites and the intended use population that you need to conduct those studies. Also, as part of our CRO services, we can also help you write the reports and do the regulatory submission for you as needed. And we can adapt to any need that you have. The goal for us is to walk you through the process so that you can be able to submit a robust dossier to the FDA so that you get your product cleared or approved. Next slide, please. So again, translating the requirements, what does that mean? From analytical data, from your LDT, you may already have some precision data, some reproducibility, some cross-reactivity. But as you go through the checklist of what you need to do for your submission, you may indeed realize that there's something that is missing. Same thing for your clinical data. And, we encourage our client also to think a little bit outside of the US. If you have any intention of going to the European market, is there something that you can actually generate from a data perspective to be in compliance with IVDR? You may decide as a company that you don't want to address that now, but sometimes adding a couple of additional testing sites to gain that information to allow you to go to the European market may be advantageous. But again, in all circumstances of what your gap is, we can help with the protocol development. And also we have access to a pretty vast network of qualified labs that can do the validation as well as the analytical testing for you. So we identify and qualify sites. We can do the monitoring for you. We will provide you frequent updates to your desire. We work for you. So, you give the requirements that you need for us to oblige to. But we also offer data management and statistical analysis, and we can also support you with the registration. Once the data is completed, you will have to put everything together, do the statistical analysis, and obviously report writing in the submission. Again, you may elect based on your product that this is something that you can handle in-house with your current resources. But I know that some of our clients do have more than one LDT in the pipeline and they need extra resources, and that's where we can come into play for you to help you with this. So I think we are to the end of the presentation. So if we go, so now we can go to questions. Do we have any questions? And again, just as a reminder, in the next few days, we will be providing you with the slides as well as the presentation recorded today. Our email address is info@mcra.com. If you have any need of a support for your product, can be just QMS, it can be just regulatory, or it can just be a clinical protocol that you need to be developed, just feel free to send us an email. Just refer in the text or the subject that it pertains to LDT, so you're going to be dispatched to this team very efficiently. The first question that we have is, what are some of the common questions people may have? Common issues, challenging with dealing with the FDA. Jim, you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you, Julie. I think one of the probably most common questions that we get from our clients have to do with what is the regulatory burden going to be getting to the market. And that really comes down to, as I mentioned during my portion of the talk, what the regulatory pathway is going to be. Of course, if you have a device that is appropriate for a 510K pathway, that usually has the lowest regulatory burden impact, given that usually the regulatory pathway is well worn and the types of validation studies are better understood by FDA. The next level of challenge is with a de novo. There you are often establishing a new regulatory paradigm, and that the clinical indication is something that's new to FDA. And so the type of clinical data that might be needed and potentially analytical data that might be needed can be something you would want to work out with FDA through their pre-submission process. And of course, the highest regulatory burden comes from a PMA device where you have a heavier pre-market burden in terms of the user fee, but also post-market burden when it comes to any changes to the device and how those have to be reported to FDA.
Thank you, Jim. Another question that came is, what do you think will be the impact of the Chevron ruling on the current final rule? You have an opinion about that?
I don't have a very strong opinion of that, other than that's certainly very interesting. I know that even prior to the Chevron ruling, there were already questions raised as to whether FDA had the regulatory authority to issue this type of a rule change. And I think the Chevron ruling only helped to reinforce that question. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Now a question for Dan. If I'm a lab, if I am a lab that knows they will need to implement a QS by the first deadline, how long do you think I would need to get a QS in place?
So it's a very good question. We have put together quality procedures for people in a hurry when they needed them. To be honest, you can put together procedures for complaint handling and medical device reporting within a period of a few weeks. And some companies take 6 or 8 months to do it. So I'm only telling you how fast it can be done. That's often not how fast it is done. At a minimum, the procedure should be written. The people who are going to be carrying out the procedure should understand how to do it. And the people who are responsible at the company should say, yes, we sign off on this, we approve it, go ahead and do it this way. So again, could be a few weeks. A lot of people take longer.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. Is there a straightforward way to determine if you're a class 1, 2, or 3 device, Jim?
That depends. So if there's a well-worn regulatory pathway that can be, fairly, we provide a lot of confidence in our estimation for the regulatory pathway. For example, devices that are intended for screening of cancer in asymptomatic populations tend to be class 3 devices, whereas similar devices, maybe even measuring the same marker for the same cancer, but are used for monitoring in someone who already is known to have cancer, those tend to be a class 2 device. So we can sometimes rely on regulatory precedent to help guide us. And other times it becomes a little bit more detailed of an evaluation, and we want to consider all of the potential risks to patients due to the potential for erroneous results for the device. And we help clients with this quite often.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Another question for you. If a lab is not sure about a test and how it qualifies under the new rule, is there a way to get confirmation directly from the FDA?
That's a great question. So FDA has a program available, which is the pre-submission program, in which you can ask them regulatory questions. They also have but probably where I would start would be, writing to their inbox for the LDT rule and see if you can gain any traction there. That might be challenging though, because they often will have to review some nuance. So that's something we also help clients with.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Any other questions? Okay, how will the FDA determine if an LDT was available to the market prior to May 6, 2024? And what documented evidence will be expected?
I'm going to pass that one off to Dan in case he was expecting that I would answer it.
All right, so
So the question is, how will the FDA determine if an LDT was available to the market?
I really apologize, Jim. I did take that as regulatory, but I guess the thing is, remember, FDA is going to be inspecting manufacturers according to the registration, right? So if a laboratory believes that they've never fallen under the final rule at all, right, then technically FDA doesn't know that the laboratory exists, right? In other words, FDA's CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, that part of FDA that deals with medical devices, technically they haven't been registered with. And FDA does inspect according to manufacturer registrations, the facility registration. So for example, if you move and didn't change your registration information, FDA will go knock on the wrong door, right? But in this case, so first of all, if a laboratory has some devices that clearly fell under the final rule and did register and list, then it's more straightforward. FDA comes in, they say, okay, can you please show us all the products you make, including the ones that you determined did not fall under this final rule. And you say, well, this one wasn't distributed, it was distributed before the final rule came into play, or wasn't distributed. FDA said, great, do you have any shipping or financial records that can show when distribution of this particular item started or stopped? That's pretty straightforward. If you're not registered, then plausibly the only way for FDA to come ask that question is if a competitor says to FDA, you know, we have this competitor, right? And their device does fall under the final rule, and they haven't registered or listed, then FDA will contact that lab and say, you know, somebody else said, we'd like to just come by and have a look if you don't mind, right? So again, that sounds a little bit far-fetched. How does FDA know? You should keep records that show why you've determined you don't fall under specific regulations. That's the easiest answer.
Okay, thank you, Dan. One additional question and we'll wrap it up. Sorry if we don't answer all your questions today. Last one is, do you foresee any impact to medical device manufacturers that supply RUO reagents to clinical labs who make LDTs from these reagents?
I think I'll handle that one. So I think one challenge could be that what we've been hearing from some of the big providers of laboratory developed tests, that a strategy for them moving forward when considering to bring on new tests that they're going to offer is that they're going to be looking for FDA cleared and approved tests when they want to increase their assay menu, rather than including and developing their own new laboratory developed tests. So that's one area where you could, potentially there could be a challenge for reagents that were supplying that industry. So I'll leave it at that. You'll have to see how that pans out, of course.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance today. If we can have last slide. Yes. So as we said, we're going to share the information to you in the next few days. But if you happen to be at ADLM this coming meeting in July, please know that MCRA has a booth at 4658. So please stop by. Jim and I will be there with other MCRA colleagues to answer some of the questions and maybe have some time to have a one-on-one with you to discuss your needs. Thank you very much.